Some say it's becoming a national epidemic. The gateway drug do. Heroin or painkillers like Vicodin or OxyContin. As illegal drugs go, heroin is not very expensive, and it's very addictive. Unfortunately, overdose and resulting deaths are all too common. I'm Dick Goldberg. Welcome to Insights. Today we'll explore why this drug is so alluring, who is most susceptible, how widespread is the problem, and what treatments, if any, work. With us is Dr. Michael Miller, addiction psychiatrist. He's the medical director of the Herrington Recovery Center at Rogers Memorial Hospital in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. He's also a director of the American Board of Addiction Medicine, and he's a recent past president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and I could go on, but we got to get to work here. Thanks for being with us, Michael.
Happy to be with you.
Is it fair to say there is a heroin epidemic in the United States?
Yes. The definition of epidemic is something that occurs at a frequency greater than what's expected, and the rates of increase in heroin use and prescription opioid use are very steep. And so there was a while that people hesitated to use the word epidemic. The Centers for Disease Control, which is our national agency for public health and prevention, they track epidemics, and they are completely on board now in their description of this as an epidemic that requires a national response.
How big is the problem? Do you have any numbers? How many people are involved in heroin?
Well, epidemic means a rate of increase more than it means absolute numbers.
Okay.
So the incidence, which means the number of new cases, has gone up significantly. Basically, over the last 10 years, there's been a tripling in the use of prescription drugs, the number of prescriptions written, and the deaths from them. And as you mentioned in your intro, these are clearly the segue to heroin. Heroin deaths are up as well. Most opioid deaths actually are not heroin deaths, but are prescription opioid deaths.
No kidding.
And so the epidemic is interrelated between the drug that's called no legitimate medical use, heroin, that in itself is an almost humorous concept in a way, and then all these approved for medical use opioids that come in a pill capsule form. So we do have a problem, and the thing that really grabbed people's attention, Dick, isn't the rate of use, the rate of addiction, but is the rate of death. The overdose death rates have tripled in the last 10 years and now exceed vehicular death rates. And so the people at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they have a division on injury prevention, deaths due to accidents, and they call this accidental death because people don't intend to overdose when they use heroin or pills. Opioids now are a bigger deal than cars and trucks.
Wow. As I recall, it's about 40,000 people a year that die in car accidents, so that's a huge number.
Well, good recollection, Dick. That's old numbers, though, because cars are safer. And for a number of reasons, vehicular deaths have been dropping, but opioid deaths have been increasing. And the paths crossed in about 2009 at about 34,000 a year.
Oh, it's close. Wow. What accounts for this? I mean, are people all of a sudden into pain meds differently, like OxyContin and that group, more than they used to be?
Well, people are using pain meds more. People are using heroin more. The problem that we probably should talk about is kids using these more and how vulnerable they are when they expose their brains to these things.
How do they get them?
There's very clear data on this. Nobody in a trench coat, nobody on a dark street corner, nobody in a tavern, nobody in a crack house. The source of the opioids that people mostly use is family member or friend, medicine cabinet or purse, and those come from a legitimate medical prescription.
So they're stealing mom and dad's drugs?
Mostly, but sometimes being given.
Come on.
Well, they're medicines, right? You got them from a doctor, right? They're safe, right? So there's this whole issue, fascinating issue in public health, the relationship between rate of engagement in a behavior and perceived harm from the behavior. Driving without a seatbelt. If you don't think it's dangerous, what happens? But if you think it's dangerous to drive without a seatbelt, maybe you'll do it. Yeah. Bicycle helmets. It's all a matter of perceived harm. And perceived harm regarding marijuana, very, very low. Perceived harm regarding prescription opioids, pretty low. Perceived harm regarding heroin, fairly high. But if you don't shoot it up, if you just sniff it, that's not that dangerous. So we do have a lot of statistics on perceived harm amongst kids and adults for a variety of chemicals, alcohol and marijuana and other things. But in the area of opioids, there's just been a vast expansion of use, and some people do connect the dots and some people don't like the dots connected, but connecting the dots between rates of prescriptions, legal prescriptions, rates of misuse of prescribed opioids, rates of addiction, rates of emergency room visits, rates of admissions to addiction treatment programs, and admissions to the morgue.
Let me understand something. I assume most people don't plan on getting addicted.
Exactly.
They take like Rush Limbaugh. They take it for pain. Right. Rush Limbaugh is a famous poster boy for people getting addicted to these things.
Yes.
And he had treatment for it and all. So, and he had pain.
Yes.
But then how do you go from getting it for pain to getting addicted and going down this road?
Would you like a Nobel Prize? Because when the answer comes, that will clearly be a Nobel Prize, because that's the question: how is the proverbial switch flipped? But there is a flipping of a switch from use to addictive use. And we understand more than we knew before, but we have a lot more to learn. Basically, you're exactly right. People begin using alcohol or marijuana or pain pills or cocaine for the psychoactive effects or the social benefits that they perceive. And they never expect to get hooked, not me. And even with tobacco, there are very interesting mindsets about it. Well, maybe I'll get hooked one day, or maybe I could develop harm one day, but I'm not smoking cigarettes in order to develop emphysema or cancer or heart disease. And people do not begin to use opioids with the intention of overdosing, but they begin with the intention of getting a buzz. Now,
really? Not reducing their pain?
Well, it's really fascinating, true, with regard to pain meds. You have people that are using them for pain and people that are using them for fun. And in older age groups, certainly over 30, pain is the number one reason that people start using. But amongst kids, they're not always starting their use because of pain, unless you say that it's really innocent, like I got exposed to opioids because I had my wisdom teeth out when I was 17. And then I had an experience with opioids. So the important thing, Dick, and we could go in many directions in this interview, but addiction itself is not about drugs. It's about brains. It's about what happens in the brain of a person who has addiction. And how do people get addiction? 60% of the probability is due to genetics and hardwiring and your predisposition. Some of it may be learned behavior. Some of it may be related to other variables like coexisting psychiatric problems or some issues with regard to personality structure. Certainly environment, stress, availability, post-traumatic stress disorder is a major factor linked to the development of addiction. But basically, you have people taking pain meds for pain, as you say. The majority, well over 80%, have no particular predisposition to addiction, and they will use them and they will stop using.
Okay.
But there is a percentage of people who, when they begin using them, notice that they are euphorogenic, notice that they like them, notice that it gives them a buzz, notice it relieves their stress, notice that it gives them a boost of energy, notice that it does this or that, I thought this was a pain med. I didn't know this was a sleep med, but it works for my sleep. I didn't know it was an anxiety med. It reduces my anxiety. I didn't know it would give me a boost of energy, but it does. I didn't know it did these other. I just noticed it does something else. I think I like that. Can I try that again?
That's worth the price of admission. I had no idea that happens.
Oh, that's what happens.
Wow.
But that only happens with people whose brain responds to opioids or cocaine or marijuana in that way.
Okay.
You see?
Yeah.
So,
and that's not a matter of necessarily being psychologically distressed. It's got to do with genetics. It's not like someone who's in a lot of emotional pain or whatever isn't the person necessarily who responds. It's genetic wiring.
I believe you're a psychologist by training.
Yeah.
And there's this idea. There's this idea, of course, that people use as self-medication. It's all about relief.
Yeah.
It's not all about relief. Some of it's just about reward. In what it does, not what negatives it takes away, but what positives it gives me.
Okay.
And I don't know if anybody has a clear answer on all addiction, how much is reward and how much is relief. All of it is some of both. But yes, there are people who take things because of the relief it provides, but a lot it's because of the reward it provides.
Okay, so there's two tracks: the adult who's taking it because they have pain, and a few of them get hooked.
Yes,
because of this. What about the path for the people who are taking these from mom and dad's medicine cabinet? How did they get hooked?
Well, they get hooked because they end up developing the whole addiction syndrome of loss of control, preoccupation, persistent use despite adverse consequences, returning to use after periods of absence, trying to quit and you can't.
That's a lot.
Even some physical dependence. They get hooked. Getting hooked means you develop this syndrome of addiction. But the message with regard to kids. Now, again, Dick, this is a real important message for all your listeners with regard to any addictive drug, including marijuana, which people just don't want to talk about as being an addictive drug, which it is. The issue has to do with the vulnerability of the adolescent brain. There's good statistics on what happens when you expose people to potentially addictive drugs and what percentage of them develop addiction. And kids develop addiction at rates that are at least double that of adults when they get exposed. Actually, it's true for gambling as well, that the rates of gambling addiction in teens, of those who gamble, compared to adults, of those who gamble, addiction is twice as high in kids as it is in adults. There's something about the adolescent brain which, when exposed to these strongly rewarding things, kids don't control it well.
Okay. Now, heroin, which is the subject of the day. What's this got to do with heroin?
Heroin. Well, heroin is available. Heroin is inexpensive. Heroin is a powerful euphoriant. Heroin is certainly used by non-oral routes. The routes that people use heroin deliver the drug to the brain very quickly. So one of the many variables in addiction has to do with the speed with which the reinforcement hits you. This is why blackjack is more addicting than horse racing. And that sounds kind of odd.
No, I get it.
It's because you get your reward quicker.
Yeah.
Okay. Orally used drugs are not as addictive as drugs used by the nasal route, the intravenous route, or the smoked route. Heroin doesn't work orally. It's shot up, it's snorted, it's smoked. Now, other opioids can be used by those routes as well, and they're quite addictive when they are. But with regard to black markets, heroin's actually less expensive than a lot of pharmaceuticals. No matter what efforts we're placing on drug control strategies, and certainly our nation has tried to control drug supply for 40, 50 years with some very deliberate policies, none of them seem to work. We need to deal with the demand, but the supply issues, we try to control the supply, and we're not effective. It's available everywhere, and the fascinating thing about heroin is its transition into everywhere in America. So heroin, there's books written on the history of heroin. Heroin shares one thing in common with marijuana, that it was primarily used in inner city minority subpopulations. And for people in rural America, suburban America, the sort of institutional racism often unconscious racism amongst us is, if it's just being used by people of color in inner city neighborhoods where I would never go, who cares? But when it's used in my neighborhood by my kids and my kids' friends, and it shows up in my schools, and it's on my tax dollars because my police are having to deal with it, and it's in my hospital, and it's in my life, now it's different. And there was a statistic, I forget how many years ago, that was fascinating. The likelihood of use of an illegal drug higher in kids who live in a city of less than 3,000 than those who live in a city of more than 500,000.
Wow.
On a percentage basis.
Why?
Well, you could. That's a whole sociological question. Maybe there's something else to do. Mm-hmm. But it's a great market. But now America's issue with addiction, which was viewed as an inner city problem at the beginning of the 20th century, when we passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Harrison Drug Act in 1914, came onto the scene in college campuses in the 60s. So it's the majority's kids. It's my kids. And now it's everywhere. It's not just college kids. It's in rural areas. It's in high schools. It's in middle schools. And so it's the availability of it anywhere that makes heroin an issue. It's the low price of it. It is highly addictive.
Can you make the connection between pain pills and why heroin? Why do they go to heroin? Why not cocaine? Why not some other drug?
Oh, no, it's the same drug class. No, the connection is very easy to make. Heroin is an opioid. It's an analgesic.
Heroin, like painkillers.
Yeah, no. Heroin is the molecular name for it, the chemical name for it, is 1,6-diacetyl morphine. It's morphine with an acetyl group at the 1 spot and the 6 spot on the benzene ring. It's basically a first cousin of morphine. Okay? And so, again, I mentioned earlier about it being a SCED 1. I mean, heroin is used as medicine in other countries. It's an opioid. It's an analgesic. It works great. It works great.
Is OxyContin an opioid?
OxyContin is a continuous release oxycodone. Yeah. So oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, methadone, codeine, morphine, 1,6-diacetyl morphine or heroin. There's your family of opioids. Okay. So it's in the same family.
Okay.
Yes.
So that I always thought heroin just fits perfectly in the family of these painkillers. And you wouldn't use other illegal drugs. You want to go to heroin because it's feels the same as these painkillers.
It is an opioid.
Okay.
Yes.
So it is fair to say it's kind of a similar high or release.
Yes. But, I mean, you're thinking, you're a bright guy. I've gotten acquainted with you, and you make connections with things. You made the connection with cocaine. Well, that's because in our culture, with our government, narcotics, illegal drugs, cocaine and heroin are put together because they're equally illegal or considered equally dangerous. And so, in dealing with drug trafficking, you look at the cocaine dealers and the heroin dealers, but pharmacologically, cocaine's very different, and heroin is just a painkiller.
Okay.
It's just a painkiller.
So, if you can't get any more of these pills, the doctor won't give them, but you like them.
Yeah.
Then how do you know heroin's the place to go rather than these other places? How does that happen, that transition?
That's sociological. That's just word of mouth. That's just word of mouth. So, I practice addiction medicine. So I take care of people once they are to the point in their lives where they're seeking help for their out-of-control substance use. Fascinating the number of people who say their views of heroin were like a lot of people's views. Oh my goodness, it's different. It's particularly bad. It's dangerous. It's illegal. It's IV. It's whatever. Heroin sounds bad. Or, I hate to say this, but heroin is what, people in minority groups use or people who are criminals use. I would never use heroin. And their dealer says, the supplies of the pills are kind of tight this week. Didn't really score any OxyContin this week. But I got something that actually works better and it's cheaper. If you want to switch, it's called heroin. Now, you probably don't want to think about this, but really, if you give it a try, happy to sell it to you. Here, I'll give it to you a sample for free. Let's see how it works. And that's fascinating that the dealers will say, why don't you try this? But there's word on the street, people amongst other drug users, well, what have you found? And the word on the street is IV's quicker than oral, and you never thought you were going to shoot up, but you might want to give it a try. And if you're looking for a particular intensity of a high, you'll be able to get it at a lower cost if it's IV and if it's heroin.
Is heroin more dangerous than the painkillers?
I wouldn't say so. Certainly, overdose happens with all. So no, it's not intrinsically more dangerous.
But we keep hearing heroin overdose. We don't hear painkiller overdose in the news.
Well, we should. That's a problem with journalism.
Okay.
It's also a bit of a problem with gaining statistics. It's a problem with what medical examiners put on death certificates. And there really is a big concern in a number of circles in addiction medicine, I know, because we see the whole range of things, and we see benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax and what they can do. The combination of sedatives and opioids is really lethal.
Oh.
So can an opioid shut down your respirations and make you turn blue and stop breathing and die by itself? Yes. But combine it with benzos, combine it with a sedative, much more lethality.
People do this
all the time. They do it accidentally. They're prescribed a benzo, and that's just in the background. I go to my doctor, I take them, I don't take them inappropriately.
And that's for what, sleep or anxiety?
Exactly. And so I take Ativan or Klonopin or Xanax. Mm-hmm. That's just in the background. I went to my doctor. That's my healthy self. I go to my doctor, I get something that helps me. Then I begin using opioids for whatever reason, and I'm putting it on this, not a clean background, but a benzo background, and that combination can be very sedating and very lethal. Now, some people admittedly find that benzodiazepines will enhance the euphoric effects of alcohol or opioids, and they'll intentionally mix them. But very few people who intentionally mix them understand the particular lethality of the combination.
Wow.
Yeah.
What makes people decide to stop? What's the turning point?
Well, it's always a balance of pluses and minuses. Finally, the minuses come into their awareness. Now, one of the problems with addiction, once somebody, you use, you get effects, you like the effects, you pursue the effects. I'm going to go seek this because I want the effects, but then I lose control over my use, and I have this addiction problem. Once you have addiction, it affects your physiology, your neurochemistry, but it also affects your psychology. And it's interesting that it makes you unaware or unattend to problems. And so an alcoholic or a marijuana addict will grossly under-recognize the problems from their use through a process of reframing or denial or what have you. And so even when problems accumulate, they're sort of immune from their feeling the pain from those problems. So when do people switch? It's not just when the negatives outweigh the positives. It's long after the negatives outweigh the positives. It's when the negatives begin to get their attention, and they're so profound that they even overcome these processes of minimization and denial in their psychology. And so finally it's like, oh damn, there's something I got to do about this.
Are interventions part of this, where the family gets everybody in a room? Does that do it?
It can be helpful. That is a mechanism. I remember back in medical school when my professor said, I just read this book about how you get people into treatment that don't want to go, when Vern Johnson's book first came out in the 1970s. Yes, Intervention by Vern Johnson. That mechanism that's become popularized on cable TV,
right.
It can be very helpful. Or the basic concepts are get a group of people to provide input, because one-on-one, usually the addiction wins.
Denial wins. They say, no, you're wrong. And you have
That's right.
You can't back up your case against the drug.
Exactly. When it's one-on-one, when it's a spouse talking to a spouse, when it's a parent talking to a child, when it's a friend talking to a friend, when it's a doctor talking to a patient even, one-on-one often is not a fair battle, because the person you're trying to convince has such strong psychological mechanisms to deny, minimize, reframe,
yes,
and say it's not really that bad, and their psychological reality is the way I'm viewing the world is exactly right, and all these other people are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is you need to have, in psychology to figure this out, enough other people. You need to have enough consensual validation of the other argument.
Yes.
A cacophony, a Greek chorus, not just one. It has to come from multiple angles. And once I realize that I'm tired of the bill collectors, once I realize I'm tired of my spouse complaining to me, once I realize I'm tired of feeling sick in the morning when I wake up, once I recognize that, having to go to a probation officer in the morning is just a pain in my life, it's just like, oh my goodness, this is too much.
How many people who come to your hospital for heroin or painkiller addiction are self-admitted versus took a whole group to push them in?
Very low single digits of the light came on. The light comes on because a bunch of people turn the spotlights on and point them right at you. And eventually you go, I think maybe I need some dark glasses. Oh no, maybe the sun is telling me something.
Mm-hmm.
No, it does happen that the people will have an aha moment for themselves, but it's usually multiple inputs from multiple sources that get them motivated.
So they get to your hospital or they get to some treatment center. What's the rate of success?
Thank you so much for asking about treatment. And even as you phrased the question at the beginning of this program, you said something about, tell me about treatment, and you couched it in a pessimistic way. If it works at all. What are the rates of success, if at all, you said? I don't know if you realized you said that.
I was trying to be open.
You were trying to
not
be...
assuming it's going to work.
Well, but you were assuming that maybe it won't.
I asked for forgiveness.
That's quite all right. But you are a part of the culture in which you live. And there is a lot of skepticism about addiction treatment. I can tell you that the best success rates are in airline pilots and health professionals, and that's in the 90 to 80% range.
What's success?
Success is actually amongst licensed health professionals. It's total abstinence, never using and never having a problem.
For how long? I mean, how long
Lifetime.
does it take?
Lifetime. And it's so there is statistics there that success is extremely high. My program that I started in a medium-sized city in the Midwest in the 1980s, an outpatient program, where we took people that are small HMO, had been sending to residential. We said, we're going to offer them an outpatient alternative. We didn't ever publish this, but we had an 82% success rates, and these were not licensed health professionals or airline pilots. These were blue-collar, white-collar, rural, suburban, all genders. But what was success that we measured? And we measured it as, at the point we're talking to you at a year or 2 years after your treatment, are you engaged in your recovery? Are you sober today and engaged in your recovery?
Sure.
And even if they've had some slips along the way, how you doing? And you can get very nice success rates, up in those ranges that people may have had a slip along the way, but there's something good that happened and they get back on track and they're doing well. The phrase that's used by an organization called Faces and Voices of Recovery is, I am in long-term recovery, and for me, that means that I haven't used in X years, and I'm able to be functional in my family and in my community. It's a very interesting message. It was researched carefully, and it works. And the message is functionality. I am not a drag on my family anymore. I'm not a drag on my town anymore. I'm productive. I'm working. I'm contributing. I'm happy.
Well, isn't it just that you're not taking the drug? What if you're not taking the drug but you're still unemployed? Or you're bummed out?
Again, different terminology. Abstinence means not using. Sobriety and recovery are a higher level. It's and of course, maybe you've heard the term, and it's a kind of it's an unfortunate term that came out of AA, dry drunk. What that means is somebody who is dry, but they're still not well. Mm-hmm. They have stopped using, but they haven't changed. They don't have serenity. They don't have productivity. They don't have whatever. But
why is that blamed on anything to do with the drug? Maybe it's just who they were before they started taking drugs.
Well, actually not. There's a lot of good data on addiction and personality and functionality. And the problem with people with addiction is not that they're a jerk. The problem is they become a jerk when their addiction is active, and they become unreliable and dishonest, unpredictable and impulsive.
So even though they're not doing the drug, they still have the behaviors from that the drug created, and
they haven't changed their behaviors. They're still maybe being dishonest, trying to figure out the easy way, trying to cut a corner.
How do you fix that?
Well, it happens through therapy. Some people do it through self-help alone, and AA has helped millions and millions of people. But seeing a professional therapist really helps. And in my business, group is always better. It gets back to some of the concepts we alluded to before. If you have one person talking with you, that's one thing. If you have a bunch of people talking with you, it's like, really? That many people think this way? Are they brainwashed? Are they brainwashing me? No, actually, they're not brainwashed. They're just nice people, and they happen to agree, and I'm the outlier. Groups are really effective for this.
And when do you need inpatient versus outpatient?
I'd be happy to answer that, but I wanted to answer a different question that you haven't asked. When do you need a medicine for this and not a medicine for this? Because the thing that's really the big change is using a drug to treat drug addiction. What a concept, using a drug to treat drug addiction. Having a pharmacological aid to your recovery. Having a medicine that can help you be well. And there are medicines now FDA approved to treat opioid addiction and nicotine addiction and alcohol addiction. The most effective actually are the ones to treat opioid addiction.
Wow.
They even work better than the ones to treat nicotine addiction. They work a lot better than the meds to treat alcohol addiction. And so people have heard of methadone. It's been around, it's been around for decades, but it's been around as a treatment of addiction in the United States for a little over 40 years. Okay, but only allowed in very special clinics with lots of regulation. But another medicine, another opioid to treat opioid addiction is buprenorphine, which has been around since 2003. And now new drug companies are bringing to the market new formulations of buprenorphine, obviously all trying to make a profit for their shareholders, but trying to help people with this medicine that really helps. And another treatment that's not an opioid to treat opioid addiction, but an opioid blocker to treat opioid addiction is naltrexone.
You mean you wouldn't enjoy the opiate if you took this drug and
you wouldn't feel it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't act.
Right.
It wouldn't make you sleepy, and it wouldn't make you dead.
Yeah.
It's a prevention of opioid overdose. Naltrexone, it's an oral form of Narcan. A lot of people have heard of Narcan. You see it in television shows that you get a Narcan shot in the ER to wake up from an overdose.
Yeah.
But an overdose, but the oral form is naltrexone. And if you take naltrexone, then you can't get a buzz and you can't overdose. So when do you need a medicine? The statistics are that most people do far better with a medicine than without. And whether it's outpatient or inpatient, which is the question you asked, getting back into the community on something that occupies your opioid receptor, so your oxycodone, your Vicodin, or your heroin can't get there, gives you a much better result.
What percentage of the people you treat do you give such a drug to?
The people that I treat with opioid addiction, I really, really work to educate them and motivate them. And I want at least 90% of them on some sort of receptor blocker. Either it's a pure blocker or it's buprenorphine or methadone that occupies the receptor and it's an effective blocker.
For life?
Great question. We don't know. Some people for life, I think, yes. I work in a residential program for the last 4 years or so before I had a big outpatient practice. In my outpatient practice, I definitely had some people that 7 years into buprenorphine after it came on the market, they were definitely headed for life. They didn't want to go off. They expected to stay on it for life. I thought it would be a great thing for them to be on it for life.
This is not how it is in the movies. In the movies, people sit around a group, realize who they are, what a jerk they were, how they want to change, and then they're fine.
Yes, there are a lot of idealized things. Let's get it out of the movies into the real world. America's approach to addiction has been, let's think about a 28-day intervention. It can be outpatient these days, but it could be residential, what have you. That's going to fix you. It's called getting the cure. It's not curative. It's helpful. It gets you started on the path. But it's a chronic disease. You need long-term engagement with help. You need to stick with it the rest of your life. Some people do go to Narcotics Anonymous the rest of their lives. Some fade away after 2 to 3 years. I would say, Dick, we don't know the neurobiology of recovery well enough, but the best hints that we have from what we do know is that it takes 2 to 5 years to get your brain back. And you should keep what I call the treatment condition in place for 2 to 5 years, whether that's professional counseling, whether that's pharmacological therapy, whether that's working through self-help through Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't want to drop out of any of those in the first 6, 12, 18 months. You want to stick with it for a couple of years.
We're just about out of time. Any ideas you haven't conveyed you think are critical before we close?
I think it's important to realize the benefits of the no-cost 75-year-old model of AA and NA. Actually, NA is much newer. People should consider going to self-help meetings. It's helpful, but a lot of people are going to need professional help beyond that. Counseling is not just for the first month. It should be for the first couple of years. And now that there's insurance parity, and your insurance company has to have the same benefits for addiction and mental health as they do for medical surgical conditions, it's hard to stay in treatment for 2 years as it was before. And consider medications. Medications, a lot of patients have their families say, don't take this, this is just a crutch or something. Thank God for crutches when you break your leg, and thank God for some assistance from medicine when you have a health problem. And this is a health problem. It's a brain disease. That's what people should know. Addiction is a brain disease, and it is treatable. And thank you for this opportunity to be with you.
Dr. Michael Miller, thank you for giving us like 4 hours in a 40-minute period.
Talked a little quick at the end, but I hope people enjoyed it.
You gave us a lot of information that's great. And I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.